When Ibrahim Traoré witnessed a homeless man being harassed on the streets of Ouagadougou, he didn't just walk by like countless others before him. He stepped out of his presidential convoy and stood up for him in a way that left an entire nation stunned and the world inspired. This wasn't a staged photo opportunity or a calculated political move. It was a raw, authentic moment that revealed the true character of a leader who governs with his heart. What happened next would spark a movement of compassion that spread far beyond the dusty streets of Burkina Faso. It was a quiet Tuesday morning in Ouagadougou, the capital city where ancient traditions meet modern struggles. The presidential convoy, 3 black SUVs with bulletproof glass and tinted windows, rolled slowly through the narrow, bustling streets. Ibrahim Traoré sat in the back seat of the middle vehicle, his eyes fixed on the city he had sworn to serve. Outside his window, the familiar rhythm of West African life unfolded. Street vendors arranging colorful fabrics under makeshift canopies, children in crisp school uniforms walking hand in hand, women gracefully balancing heavy baskets on their heads, and motorcycles weaving through traffic with practiced ease. The morning air was thick with the scent of burning charcoal and fresh bread from roadside bakeries. Traoré had made this journey through the city countless times since becoming president, but he never tired of seeing his people going about their daily lives. Unlike many world leaders who travel in sterile bubbles, isolated from reality, Traoré insisted on routes that took him through ordinary neighborhoods where real people lived real lives. But suddenly, the peaceful morning was shattered by the sound of angry shouting. A crowd had formed near a busy street corner, their voices rising above the usual urban noise. Even through the thick, bulletproof glass of his vehicle, the sound of jeers and cruel laughter pierced the air with disturbing clarity. "Move along, old man," someone barked with vicious contempt. "You don't belong here." Traoré leaned forward, his jaw tightening as his eyes scanned the scene unfolding before him. There, in the center of a hostile crowd, stood an elderly homeless man. His clothes were nothing more than tattered rags, his hair matted and gray, his weathered face bearing the deep lines of a life marked by suffering. In his trembling hands, he clutched a small, worn plastic bag to his chest, as if it contained his entire world. 2 young men, probably in their 20s, towered over the frail figure like predators circling wounded prey. They shoved him repeatedly, their faces twisted with cruel amusement as he stumbled backward against a concrete wall. The crowd around them had formed a circle, some laughing, others recording with their phones, but none intervening. The old man's eyes darted around desperately, searching for even a single sympathetic face, but finding only indifference and mockery. The presidential driver, following standard security protocols, began to accelerate past the disturbance. Street confrontations were common in any large city, and the security team's job was to keep the president moving, to maintain the schedule, to avoid any potential risks. But then Ibrahim's voice cut through the silence of the vehicle like a blade. "Stop the car." The driver's foot moved to the brake, uncertainty in his voice. "Sir, stop the car. Now." The SUV screeched to a halt, its tires grinding against the dusty asphalt. The other vehicles in the convoy stopped abruptly behind them, causing confusion among the security detail. Through their earpieces, urgent voices crackled. "Eagle 1 has stopped. Repeat, Eagle 1 has stopped. What's the situation?" Before anyone could respond or protest, Traoré's hand was already on the door handle. His chief security officer spun around from the front seat, alarm in his eyes. "Mr. President, this is not advisable. We haven't secured the area." There could be, but Ibrahim was already stepping out of the vehicle and onto the street. The moment his polished black boots touched the ground, a hush fell over the crowd like a blanket. People who had been laughing and jeering suddenly froze, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. Phones that had been recording the harassment of a homeless man suddenly turned toward the unexpected figure who had just emerged from the presidential convoy. Traoré stood tall, his presence commanding immediate attention. He wore a simple but well-tailored dark suit. No flashy jewelry, no ornate decorations. Just the quiet dignity of a man who understood that true power came from character, not costume. His security team scrambled out of their vehicles, hands instinctively moving toward their weapons. But Traoré raised a calm hand to signal them to stand down. The two young men who had been tormenting the homeless man froze like statues, their bravado evaporating instantly. One of them stammered, his voice cracking with sudden fear. We didn't know. We weren't." Ibrahim raised his hand, not in anger but in a gesture that commanded silence. His gaze was steady, penetrating, and somehow both stern and compassionate. The power of his presence alone was enough to make their cruel confidence crumble completely. The crowd pressed closer, but maintained a respectful distance, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Then, to everyone's absolute amazement, the president of Burkina Faso did something that no one, not his security team, not the crowd, not even he himself had planned. He walked directly to the homeless man and slowly, deliberately, crouched down in front of him until they were at eye level. The symbolism was unmistakable. A powerful leader lowering himself to meet someone society had abandoned. Gently, with the tenderness one might show to a frightened child, Traoré placed his hand on the old man's trembling shoulder. His voice, when he spoke, was soft but carried clearly in the stunned silence. "You don't have to be afraid anymore, my brother. Not while I'm here." The homeless man's lips trembled uncontrollably. His eyes, clouded with cataracts and filled with decades of pain, widened in disbelief. He tried to speak, but only broken sounds emerged. Tears began to stream down his dirt-streaked cheeks, carving clean paths through the grime. In that moment, he wasn't just a homeless man. He was every person who had ever felt invisible, forgotten, worthless. The two young aggressors took several steps backward, their faces now burning with shame. The crowd around them had fallen completely silent, many wiping tears from their own eyes. This wasn't the Burkina Faso they knew, where the powerful ignored the powerless, where suffering was met with indifference. Traoré stood slowly and turned to face the gathered crowd. His voice carried the authority of his office, but also the warmth of genuine conviction. "A nation that mistreats its weakest members has no future worth building. This man," he gestured toward the homeless figure, "is your brother too. He is my brother. And anyone who harms him harms us all." People began to lower their heads in shame, murmuring quietly among themselves. Some crossed themselves, others whispered prayers. The weight of his words settled over them like a revelation. But this powerful moment was only the beginning of something even more extraordinary. Traoré motioned to one of his aides, a young man who had been standing frozen in amazement. "Bring water and food from the car. And bring blankets." The aide nodded quickly and ran toward the convoy, his hands shaking as he retrieved supplies that were always kept for emergencies. The homeless man clutched his small plastic bag tightly against his chest, as if afraid someone would snatch away his only possessions. Traoré noticed this protective gesture and knelt beside him again, his movements slow and non-threatening. "What's in the bag, my friend?" he asked gently, his voice filled with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. The man hesitated for a long moment, his eyes darting between Traoré and the crowd. Then, with trembling fingers, he slowly opened the worn plastic bag. Inside were the remnants of a life that had once meant something. A faded photograph of a woman and two small children, their faces barely visible through years of handling. A cracked plastic comb, and a folded piece of paper with edges so worn they were almost transparent. Traoré picked up the photograph with infinite care, handling it as if it were made of the most delicate glass. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Your family." The homeless man nodded, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks. "Gone," he whispered, the word carrying the weight of unbearable loss. "All gone." The crowd leaned in, straining to hear, their own hearts breaking as they witnessed this intimate moment of shared humanity. Traoré studied the photograph for a long moment, then carefully placed it back in the bag. Before standing, he looked directly into the man's eyes with an intensity that seemed to peer into his very soul. "You are not gone," he said firmly. "And as long as you breathe, you have worth. You have dignity. You have value. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." By now, many people in the crowd were crying openly. Even the two young men who had been harassing him looked ashamed, their faces red with remorse. The aide returned with water bottles, packets of food, and a clean blanket. Traoré took them personally and handed them to the homeless man, who accepted them as if they were the most precious gifts in the world. But the president wasn't finished. What happened next would transform not just one man's life, but would spark a movement that would spread across social media and touch hearts around the globe. Word of the extraordinary scene spread with the speed of wildfire in the digital age. Within minutes, dozens of phones were pointed in their direction. Live streams were broadcasting the encounter across social media platforms, and news outlets were being alerted to the unprecedented sight of a president kneeling in the street with a homeless man. But Traoré seemed oblivious to the cameras, completely focused on the human being in front of him. The homeless man's hands shook as he held the water bottle, and Traoré noticed his difficulty. Without hesitation, the president helped him open it and held it steady as the man drank slowly, his parched lips grateful for every drop. "What is your name?" Traoré asked softly. "Jonas," the man whispered, his voice barely audible. "Jonas Ouedraogo." A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Hearing his name spoken aloud somehow made Jonas more real, more human. He wasn't just the homeless man anymore, he was Jonas, a person with an identity, a history, a story. Traoré repeated the name with respect, Jonas Ouedraogo. Then, still crouched beside him, he continued, "Jonas, you have suffered much, haven't you?" Jonas nodded weakly, his body trembling with emotion. "I lost everything, Mr. President. My wife died of malaria, we couldn't afford the medicine. My children, they went to live with relatives who barely had enough for themselves. I lost my job at the textile factory when it closed. Then I lost my house. I used to matter. I used to be somebody. Then one day, I just wasn't." His words cut through the crowd like a knife. The pain in his voice was so raw, so honest, that several people began crying openly. Here was the face of economic hardship, of a system that had failed its most vulnerable citizens. Traoré placed both hands on Jonas's shoulders, looking directly into his eyes. "You still matter, Jonas. Right now, in this moment, you matter. And you always have." Then, turning to address the crowd that had grown to nearly 100 people, Traoré raised his voice just enough for all to hear. "Every Jonas we ignore, every brother or sister we walk past, every human being we treat as invisible, each time we do this, we lose a little bit of our own humanity. We become smaller, meaner, less than what God intended us to be." The crowd was completely silent now, heads bowed in reflection and shame. Jonas covered his face with his hands and wept openly, his shoulders shaking with the release of years of pain and loneliness. Suddenly, one of the young men who had been harassing Jonas stepped forward. His hands were visibly shaking, and tears were streaming down his face. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice breaking with emotion. "I didn't think about, I just saw." He couldn't finish his sentence, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his cruelty. Then, in a moment that would be replayed millions of times on social media, the young man dropped to his knees in front of Jonas. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry. Please forgive me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even Jonas looked stunned, lowering his hands to stare at the young man kneeling before him. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, nobody moved, nobody spoke. Then Jonas, this broken man who had every reason to harbor hatred and resentment, did something that defied all expectations. Slowly, tentatively, he reached out his weathered hand and placed it on the young man's head in a gesture of blessing. "You heard me," Jonas said softly, his voice filled with wonder rather than anger. "You actually heard me." The young man nodded through his tears, and Jonas, in a moment of grace that left everyone speechless, leaned forward and embraced him. The bully and his victim, locked in an embrace of forgiveness that seemed to heal something broken in the very air around them. Traoré rose to his full height, his face solemn but filled with quiet pride. He addressed the crowd once more. his voice carrying the weight of profound truth. This is what real strength looks like. Not cruelty, not indifference, not the power to harm, but the courage to forgive, the wisdom to see clearly, and the love to act with compassion. For several minutes, the only sounds were quiet weeping and the gentle click of camera shutters capturing a moment that would inspire millions. The embrace between Jonas and the young man continued, both of them crying, both of them somehow transformed by this unexpected encounter with grace. As the two men held each other, a woman's voice suddenly called out from the back of the crowd, "Jonas? Oh my God! Is that really you?" Heads turned as an older woman pushed her way through the gathering, her colorful head wrap slipping as she moved urgently forward. Her eyes were wide with shock and disbelief, her hands trembling as she got closer. Jonas's head snapped up at the sound of the familiar voice. His mouth fell open as he stared at the approaching woman. "Adele?" he whispered, his voice filled with impossible hope. It was his sister, whom he hadn't seen in over 10 years. She had assumed he was dead, and he had lost all hope of ever seeing family again. Adele fell to her knees beside her brother, her hands reaching out to touch his face as if to confirm he was real. "Oh, Jonas," she sobbed, cradling his head in her hands. "We thought you were gone. We searched everywhere. We never stopped hoping, but—" Jonas collapsed into her arms, sobbing with a mixture of joy and relief that seemed to pour out of him like water from a broken dam. The reunion was so powerful, so unexpected, that even the hardest hearts in the crowd melted completely. Traoré stepped back slightly, allowing the siblings their moment while maintaining his protective presence. He whispered quietly to his aide, "Find out where she lives. Make sure she has everything she needs to help him. And arrange for medical care. He needs to see a doctor." As Adele held her brother, rocking him gently like she might have when they were children, the crowd began to do something unprecedented. One by one, people started placing money at Jonas's feet. Not as charity but as an act of respect, of recognition. Then came food, bread, fruit, bottles of water. Someone placed a pair of clean shoes beside him. A woman offered a clean shirt. Jonas stared at the growing pile of gifts, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I don't deserve this," he whispered, overwhelmed by the sudden outpouring of kindness. Traoré crouched down one final time, meeting Jonas's gaze with eyes full of conviction. "Yes, you do," he said gently but firmly. "You deserve this and so much more." The crowd erupted in applause, but it wasn't the polite clapping of a political rally. It was the raw, emotional response of people who had witnessed something that restored their faith in humanity. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Traoré stood and extended his hand to Jonas. "Come," he said simply. "Let me walk you home." Jonas hesitated, looking at the president's outstretched hand as if it might disappear. Then, slowly he reached out and took it. The crowd gasped as the president of Burkina Faso and a homeless man began walking down the street together, side by side. Traoré carried Jonas's small bag over his own shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes about his character. Every few steps, he would glance down at Jonas, asking quietly if he was tired, if he needed to rest. Behind them, hundreds of people followed at a respectful distance, creating an impromptu procession of hope. Adele walked beside her brother, her hand in his, still unable to believe this miraculous turn of events. Children peered out from doorways to watch the extraordinary parade pass by. Elderly women called out blessings from their windows. Young men who might have once mocked someone like Jonas now looked on with newfound respect. When they reached the edge of the neighborhood where Adele lived, Jonas's legs finally gave way. But before he could fall, Traoré caught him and, without hesitation, lifted him gently into his arms. The image of a president carrying a homeless man through the streets was captured by dozens of cameras and would become one of the most shared photographs in social media history. The world watched in awe as this simple act of compassion unfolded in real time, proving that in an age of cynicism and division, authentic leadership could still move hearts and change lives. That evening, Traoré personally ensured that Jonas was not just given temporary shelter, but was enrolled in a program that would provide him with permanent housing, healthcare, and job training. He visited Jonas regularly, not for publicity, but because he had given his word. The story of their encounter became a global phenomenon, inspiring similar acts of kindness in cities around the world. #BeJonas began trending, encouraging people to notice and help those society had forgotten. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of that Tuesday morning was this. It reminded everyone watching that true leadership isn't about power or position. It's about having the courage to see the humanity in every person and the wisdom to act on that recognition. Jonas eventually found work, reconnected with his extended family, and became an advocate for homeless rights. The young man who had harassed him became one of his closest friends and volunteers at a shelter Jonas helped establish. And Ibrahim Traoré? He continued governing not just with policies and politics, but with the understanding that real change begins when leaders remember that every citizen, even the most forgotten ones, deserves dignity, respect, and hope. As Traoré often says, we must not only govern with our minds, but lead with our hearts, because a nation is only as strong as how it treats its weakest members. That Tuesday morning in Ouagadougou, a president stopped his convoy for a homeless man named Jonas. But in doing so, he didn't just change one life, he reminded an entire world what true leadership looks like.